Order, order. So I'd like to start by welcoming Dame Caroline Dinenage and members of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee to this joint sitting of the two committees on AI and copyright. And I also really want to welcome our witnesses. We're very pleased to have the opportunity today to speak to you about artificial intelligence and copyright in the context of the government's consultation. And I do want to say that we also did reach out to some of the larger developers, shall we say, on this issue. We invited Google and OpenAI to join us. However, they told us that as the government consultation is still live, they were unable to take part in this public session, and we chose not to press them. But I do want to emphasize that I think having a public understanding of how these decisions are being made within tech companies as well as within government is really important. But with that, let us first go on to our guests. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself when the question is presented to you. The government consultation on copyright and AI basically sets out an opt-out approach, which it says is prerequisite, or its preferred option is an opt-out approach, prerequisite on having the appropriate technology for opting out and for increased transparency of inputs and outputs. And I want to start with Vinous to introduce yourself and let us know, as a representative of a large tech sector, you're probably still preparing your response to the government consultation, but can you say a little bit about your preferred outcome?
Absolutely. Firstly, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm here on behalf of the Startup Coalition. We have about 4,000 startups within our ecosystem, and we're here to represent the voice of startups, scale-ups, and the investors that support them. So I think what I will start by saying is, as the Startup Coalition, we're really clear that our main endeavour is to make sure that the UK is the best place for startups to build their companies and to scale here in the UK rather than sort of moving abroad. We have so many of the raw ingredients here that make the UK, a beacon in the world for startups and scale-ups. We have deep pools of talent, we have world-class universities and research institutes as well. And so really it's about, how do we go above and beyond to compete with the likes of the US, which obviously has very deep capital markets, and actually, closer to home, the EU, who have, 500 million consumers in a single marketplace. And that's really the sort of challenge that, I would set out today in terms of, those are the competition and how do we compete? In the particular realm of AI and the AI ecosystem, there are two sort of critical ingredients. The first is compute and access to compute, and we're really pleased to see that the government's going to be bringing forward a strategy, and Rachel Reeves's speech recently, resetting on growth and making sure that, barriers to planning, etc., are being brought down, is going to be fundamental to that. The second piece of the puzzle is access to large-scale data. And again, the government's made really welcome noises. So, we're really pleased to see the government looking at opening up its own data sets. So whether that's sort of, in the departments themselves or with arm's length bodies like the British Library or the Natural History Museum with the National Data Library. So I think, we're hearing really, really positive things, and that I hope is encouraging to our startups and scale-ups. But fundamentally, publicly available data on the internet is the biggest data source. And in order to sort of train these models, you do want to have the largest possible database to access. It means that the models are more diverse, they're having more inputs, and we think that creates better outputs, so much more sort of, accurate representations on the other side. So, whatever comes out of the machine. And so we think, the preferred option for us, if we do want to compete with the likes of the United States, who have a fair use policy, is option 2. And I say that not to be not constructive with the debate, and in our response, we'll go into, and further today, we'll go into sort of like the complexities around that. But when startups are looking at where to build their companies, they're looking, not just, at London or where in the UK. They're looking at the sort of global picture. And as I say, you have the likes of the US with their fair access and fair use policy. You have Japan, Singapore, Israel, who have all created very permissive regimes for training models. And so if we want to compete against that, that's sort of the essay question.
Thank you very much for that. Could you just, and I think you've made the position very clear, but could you just clarify, Vinous, will you be proposing technical solutions to accommodate option 3, do you think? Or will you...
So I think a lot of the companies that we sort of speak on are looking at those technical solutions. What I would say is that those technical solutions don't necessarily exist in the way they need to today. So, for example, they aren't standardized, they may be not interoperable, it may not be sort of, machine readable, etc. Exactly. And I think until we have those sort of technical solutions, it puts startups in a very difficult position if we essentially we are legislating ahead of what is technically feasible today and I guess economically viable for startups. What we don't want to be in is a position where the largest players can pay their way through and startups and scale-ups are locked out.
Okay, thank you very much for this. And I think we'll now hear from James, who represents someone who is developing technological solutions in this area. And James, could you briefly, it's a very complex area, you all know, but could you briefly describe where you sit on the in this area and what solutions you are developing and how they address the issues of transparency of inputs, transparency of outputs, and ease of opt-outs?
Sure, absolutely. I'll try my best.
Couple of minutes.
So, hi everyone. I'm James. I'm the CEO of a startup called Human Native AI. We're only 9 months old, 10 months old, I think, at this point, so it's very early in our journey. We were founded in the UK last year, so we're one of the startups that Vinous represents as part of the Startup Coalition. We're a slightly unusual startup in that what we're trying to do is help tackle this issue. And particularly, we're looking to try to enable more licensing by AI companies. So I come from the product and engineering side. So actually appearing in front of these committees, this is a new experience for me, so bear with me.
Doing very well.
Well, last time so this is actually only my second ever day as a professional wearing a suit. My first one was the House of Lords inquiry in November. So, yeah. But we've been looking at how we build AI models, companies like Google and OpenAI, etc., they require huge amounts of data to power these models. I think that's all well understood. The internet has generally been already consumed into these models. I think we have to all accept that as truth as well. Now, whether you agree that's correct or not is a difficult issue, and there are some jurisdictions where it may or may not be legal. What our company is trying to do is help AI companies get access to the content they need to improve the models beyond that in a fair and equitable way. So we run basically a data marketplace. We enable AI companies to purchase data legally and fairly from the creative community. You can think of us as trying to help get generative AI out of its Napster era and think about what is a more legitimate era. So we've been on an interesting journey over the last 9-10 months. We've spoken to a lot of people on both sides of this debate, and we've heard interesting things from them. We've heard the creative community express anger and frustration at this issue, which I think is natural. That sometimes they feel like their work is being stolen, and for many of them it's very, very personal. And I'm sure you'll hear from some great witnesses on that later today. But from the AI company's perspective, they also feel frustration. They're trying to compete. They're building new world-class products, and data is essential to build it. Whenever you hear AI today, just think about it as it's just a reflection of the data that goes into it. So my colleague here made a really great point about you consume the internet. The internet has great diversity of content. The internet has incredible bias of content. And imagine if you're building an AI model today and you wanted to counteract that bias. You might look to bring in some really reputable data that helps to balance out, for example, political leaning. That is something that you can do by accessing and licensing appropriate data. That's what our company helps to facilitate. So on this particular issue with the government, I would say I think the challenge is that a lot of the damage on text and data mining has probably already been done. the original sin, if you like, has happened. And I think the question is, how do we move forward? And what I would like to see the government do is put more effort into supporting licensing as a viable alternative monetization model for the internet in the age of these new AI agents.
Thank you very much, James. How could the government support license? Sorry.
I was just going to ask a quick question. So what needs to happen technologically to actually have a licensing system that's still in the hands of the creator?
Absolutely the question I wanted to put. So there you are. What needs to happen so that the licensing is in the hands of the creators, easy to access, simple, and comprehensive?
There's a fantastic question. There's lots of great options, and this is what our company is trying to tackle. I would lay out a couple of different points. The first is simply streamlined legal access. And I think this is where the government could particularly help. There are major challenges for many in the rights holder sector, particularly things like audio-visual, maybe for example television, about clearing the rights for their content. So you can imagine if you make television shows, that may have the writers and the producers who you have to clear rights with. It may have the talent on screen. It may have some music in the background. It may even have a Coke can on a table somewhere, and you would need to clear all of those rights under the current legislation before you were able to offer that content for AI training rights. Because until 18 months ago, no one ever wrote the words AI training rights into a contract. And so I think that's a particular challenge that the government could help with, some type of more permissive system to enable rights holders to do best effort attempt to contact people and enable license and an extended copyright regime effectively. The second major challenge would probably be technical, would be access to the data, not only finding the right data, so discovery, but then being able to aggregate it together and then provide it to AI companies in a way that's sustainable and scalable. So for example, let's say an AI company wanted a UK news package. They would go around and speak to all the news companies in the UK and maybe license from 3 or 4 of them. But every time they do a license, that's a bespoke negotiation, a bespoke legal document, and a bespoke technical integration to extract that information. Hopefully services like our company could streamline that and provide one technical integration, for example, to access all that different content. And then if they think globally and want to access 40 newspapers globally, then again, you really start to see the benefits of a single aggregation platform for that. And then the final thing I would say is making sure everybody gets paid. Being able to collect all the money in from licensing and then being able to distribute it out. I think CMOs maybe have a large part to play in that, but there's some also really interesting challenges there. So I think around getting the data together, the legal side, being able to deliver it, and then probably making sure everyone gets paid.
Thank you very much, James. We'll now just go to Sebastian Posth, who's joining us virtually. And Sebastian is an area that I'm fascinated by from my background in engineering, as the international, was co-initiator of the International Standard Content Code. Now, standardization has I would think, a huge part to play here. We've heard a little bit about all the different ways in which rights can be asserted and in which content can or cannot be aggregated. So, Sebastian, could you, as well as introducing yourself, briefly outline, some of the key technical requirements for effective rights reservation methods, such as the ones you've co-developed? And we heard from James about, the need for AI developers to go out and find the content and negotiate. But I'm also thinking, we're all thinking of individual authors or singers, or how do they assert or reserve their rights in an easy and accessible way? So perhaps you could talk us briefly through that.
Okay, so maybe just a brief introduction. Sebastian Posth. I'm a German citizen currently residing in the Netherlands, so I bring some of the European background, not only in terms of the discussion that is taking place currently in the context of the Code of Conduct of the European AI Office. For the last 20 years, I've been working in publishing together with media organizations in the context of digital distribution, and in this, from this background, I have been one of the co-initiators of the ISCC that you already mentioned, the International Standard Content Code, and served as a convener of this working group and its successor, which is a technical report at ISO level on what is called soft binding. I'm the founder of the
ISO is the International Standards Organization, so that's the standard becomes sort of comprehensive and universal. Yeah.
Correct, where the ISCC has been developed in a working group with experts from 29 countries over the term of 5 years, and the ISCC has been published as ISO 24138 in May of last year, so 24. So it's a rather new standard, and so it's important to talk about it, to introduce its capabilities. Liccium, which I'm the founder and CEO, is a rights management platform that allows creators, individual creators that you already mentioned, but also larger rights holders to make what we call asset-based declarations of their preferences, of their rights and preferences and other metadata. But in this context, it's relevant that these preferences are with regards to the use of the content for training models and applications of generative AI. I would also note that I'm not a lawyer, but a technologist, as my colleague, and developing software that can be used for creators and rights holders to simplify the workflows and the processes. And I'm happy to introduce to you the technical possibility of making these asset-based opt-out declarations, which I would like to say is obviously not the first choice of creators and rights holders who for good reasons, have a preference on opt-in or content licensing when it comes to training AI models. Looking at the technical solutions, the key requirements, so to speak, we have to observe the special situation that we're in, that in most cases, the AI model providers already have access to the content. And this is something that is of interest, because the question basically is, how can two parties, like on the rights holder on the one hand and the model provider on the other, who are not in a contractual relationship, that both have access to the same content, exchange information about this? And I would say that this is three components. One is content identification. So you have to be able to unambiguously identify the media content that you are talking about. Then the second, what I would call metadata binding. So you have to find a way to inseparably bind metadata and rights information like training preferences to the media asset itself. And then you have to develop a vocabulary that makes sure that everyone knows what to do when you're talking about opt-out. So opt-out of what? Of text and data mining, and or opt-out of training models of AI, generative AI. So these are the questions that have been raised in the context of the European discussion. So these are
the questions. Do you feel that your standards address those questions?
Yeah.
And
so
just specifically also because James raised the issue of retrospectiveness, said that the original sin had already been committed, as it were. Can the implementation of your standards, could that be implemented, if you like, retrospectively as well?
Yes. So let me briefly explain how the soft binding approach would work. So soft binding in comparison to hard binding, where you try to include rights and metadata into the media file itself. So like in the embedded metadata. This is a problem because metadata gets stripped when content is being shared online. It's very easy to remove the metadata. So what we try to do is what we did was provide the standard that allows anyone that has access to the content to apply the ISO standardized algorithm and generate a short identifier string from the media file itself. What that means is that anyone who has access to the same or similar content can generate the same or similar ISCC code from the media file itself. The second step is that the rights holder would bind metadata to the content-derived identifier that has been generated, and makes this data set, the ISCC code and the rights holder preferences, publicly accessible so that anyone with access to the content can actually resolve. What you mentioned with retrospectively bind metadata, this is possible because you can update these declarations, and when, let's say, the AI model provider would use specific media assets for training, they would, in this process, generate the code and then get access to the latest update of this declaration that has been, in our case, digitally signed by the creator and rights holder. So this is a way to also update licensing terms or rights reservations to the content.
Thank you very much. There seems to be a combination of identifying the creative content plus easily, universally accessible databases of what that ID means. Now, I think, Vinous, do you want to say something quickly before we...
Yes, just very quickly. I think these models are incredibly interesting, but again, I would just sort of, make two arguments. The first is that the US doesn't require any of this.
Right.
So, again, how do we keep UK startups here? Okay. Their talent, their tax receipts, etc. First point. Second point, very quickly. That all is great. Is it accessible to startups? As in, are they able to sort of, if someone decides to opt out in the future, etc., that sort of continual checking and updating, that is, a cost, it's a compliance cost that, we should consider.
And I think the government will do that in the consultation. Now, I think, Natasha, did you want to say something?
Very briefly, I'm really interested in that sort of the perspective of startups and how they scale up their business models and things like that. But on the other side of that, how do you envisage creatives being paid for their content, and how do you envisage that industry still thriving if, as you stated, you would prefer option 2, which is sort of, do what America's doing or whatever, but how do you expect UK creatives to protect their income if we move to model 2?
So respectfully, I would say, the US has a thriving tech sector, and it also has a thriving creative industry. I would say, Japan and Singapore, Israel all have creative industries that are thriving. Secondly, I think, this binary is misleading in some ways. This isn't about a right to sort of copy and paste and regurgitate work. The models that are being trained on vast swathes of data, I'm talking about sort of, millions, perhaps billions of data points, aren't, reading, copying and pasting. It's learning. So if you think about, say, a student who goes to university and there are very clear rules around plagiarism. They can't simply copy and paste previous work.
Sorry. I don't really want to rerun the argument of the creative industries versus the tech industries. We want to understand what the technical options are, and because I think that's an argument that's been talked about a lot, and we don't have very much time. So I'm going to ask Caroline to come in.
Thank you, Chair. Just briefly to pick up Vinous, you talked about the situation in the US, but fair use in the US isn't settled, is it? I mean, that's why we're seeing all these lawsuits. To what extent does that come into play?
I think, we'll see how everything plays out in the US. I would say, I have absolutely no control of what happens there. Although I would say, the administration today, it's unlikely that it's going to move to a position to be much more restrictive. Similarly, that's one market. There are others that are seeing this as an opportunity. So, and the creative sector does benefit from artificial intelligence. Chi, I completely agree with you. This is not a binary, a zero-sum game. It is additive. It's about how do you, put these tools into the hands of creatives who, whether they use that in post-production, whether they use it to create new forms of art. It's certainly not a zero-sum game at all, and I don't want to suggest that for a second.
Okay, so if you want to pick up
With my question.
the technology.
Yeah, so last week we saw the China-based AI model, DeepSeek, launch, knocking a combined $1 trillion off of tech companies' market caps. The OpenAI told the FT that it has evidence that its intellectual property was used to build DeepSeek. So we talked a lot about competition in your opening words. You all talked a lot about competition. But, I mean, isn't that just plain common sense that when the door is open to widespread IP infringement, that it will come back to bite you? To what extent, James, do you think that's karma?
I think it's a difficult point. I think there's a lot of things at play here. I mean, geopolitically as well, there's a lot of interesting things happening. I would say that people will use whatever tools are available to them to make products and make things better, in which case the open web was there, and there are cases that are quite rightly being litigated to find out whether that is open to be used. I think there's a lot of mindset in the tech companies because of the competitive pressures they're under to move very quickly and to build with what they have available to them. And that's what looks like this Chinese company did. I mean, obviously, that's still to be finalised. But if they did, there could be argument that it's an interesting use of other tools and other technologies that's around. I think what is perhaps the more interesting argument for the creative sector here is that this presents more opportunity for them. I would actually go back and say that, I think to one of the questions earlier on the panel was like, how will they make money? The more AI companies that are looking for data to improve their models, I think represents opportunity for the creative community. New and interesting monetization models. There is always going to be a great creative community and a great creative sector because people will look for human connection when they look at pieces of art or music or other things. I don't think that's going away and going to be replaced by AI music anytime soon. But I do think that AI tools can help improve and create new opportunity that are then trained on great creative works. This can be a win-win if we can engage with it in that way.
Interesting.
Very briefly, just one other question. On Friday, Vinous, Sam Altman said on Reddit that OpenAI has been on the wrong side of history when it comes to open sourcing its technologies. Do you think it would have been more apt to say that OpenAI has been on the wrong side of history when it comes to IP infringement? And to what extent does that bode for the future?
So listen, I mean, the chair said right at the beginning that OpenAI was asked to be here and they weren't able to come. I'm really not here to speak for OpenAI. That's not the constituency that I represent at all. I would say that the DeepSeek explosion is really, really exciting for us sitting here in the UK. One of the things that I've heard a million times is, we're not going to create these types of models anyway. We're already out of the game. That ship has sailed. It's far too expensive, etc. Actually what DeepSeek shows us is that it can be done a lot cheaper, and what we can expect is that actually efficiencies will continue to be made, opening up this competition again. And what I want is for UK founders to be leading that charge rather than going, to the US and as James says, moving quickly there because they're enabled to.
I'm very keen for us to continue on the technology and not to rehearse arguments. So I'm going to ask Steve to come in right now.
Thank you, Chair. And just to note at the beginning, Chair, that Startup Coalition provides the secretariat for the Climate Tech APBG, which I chair. So just for the record, I just want to move on to transparency of inputs and outputs. And obviously, in the UK, we want to see ever more sort of startups and setting up and then scaling up, both leading on AI, but also utilising AI for new and exciting sort of businesses. In terms of transparency requirements for you, Vinous, and for your members, what would be the impact or the opportunity around sort of transparency in and out of that data?
Thanks for the question, Steve. So I think really for us, what we'll hold it up to is it actually something that startups can comply with? That's always the biggest question, and so we're really excited to look at sort of technologies that James and Sebastian are putting forward to because those technologies are all about making these arrangements much more streamlined, more accessible, etc. So we're excited to see where that technology goes. But I mean, we're looking at what's happening at the EU at the moment, and what we're seeing so far is that these transparency requirements could be put at a threshold that essentially locks smaller players outside of the market. You know, they can't perhaps comply, they can't continue to go back and make sure that they're updating it. And it's just a further compliance cost for them. So we just want to make sure that, you know, wherever we draw that line, it is accessible to startups. And that sort of, you know, is the same for whether we sort of reopen the debate around robot TXT, etc. It's just about, you know, making sure that startups can compete to upend the market once again, really.
Increased competition. James, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I would echo Venus's points, really, is that I think it's about, if the government wants to encourage growth, then I think it wants to find solutions that are going to enable SMBs to effectively compete, both on the AI side, but also SMBs on the creative side as well. I think there is a real opportunity for example, we're working with a UK-based startup today, very small operation that's only founded last year, and they are licensing data to improve their models, and they're doing so in a fair and legitimate way, and the founders are very ethically minded and want to do this. We should be encouraging that. We should make it easy for them to access amazing content the UK produces to pull if the government wants to go after growth. And likewise, we should make it easy for small creative communities who have amazing content to participate in a market where there is demand for their content. And by doing so, by helping them clear rights and other things like that, the opportunity is there for them.
So if I'm right, your company, James, might be one of the tools that would help startups and scale-ups to comply with any new sort of transparency requirements. Is that right?
That's right. We would help them license the data. Through licensing data through us, they would have the ability to produce a compliance report, which they could then submit to any transparency requirements in any jurisdiction. So yes, if they were to acquire only licensed content through us, then they would be easily able to comply with the transparency requirements.
Thank you. Then in the consultation, it says that some R&D funding might be made available to help support new sort of tools to encourage greater transparency. Do you think that's necessary? Do you think that's a sort of a necessary part of what might be a new sort of ecosystem, or do you feel like you're doing it already and that's unnecessary and there's plenty of competition out there to help support companies to do this better?
I think there's a really interesting opportunity for the government to get involved and to produce some new paths. I think there is a lot of great content, a lot of great data that is within the government's realm of influence, shall we say, where they could help to move things forward. So, for example, you'll notice that the report, the action plan, lays out a couple of British institutions. I've been fortunate that I've spoken to some of those institutions, and actually what they're concerned about is can we get 10 data privacy officers involved before we can even move forward in understanding what this is? The current regime that we have around data in the country is very restrictive. And so I think if we wanted to do that, I think the government getting involved in trying to find ways to move that forward would be really interesting.
Actually, that's a really good segue into my next sort of question. So what do you think might need to be changed in the sort of regulatory underpinning to encourage this all?
I'll very much preface this with I'm not a lawyer, and we have some experts behind us as well. I think from my perspective, I think making it easy for companies to be able to say, we have done our homework, we have contacted as many rights holders as we can, we have cleared the majority of rights, and then therefore making that available. I think there are similar regimes, again, available in things like where the copyright holder may have passed or is uncontactable. There's similar provisions that enable works to be generated and sold on. I think those types of things would be very interesting. I think if there is anything the government can do to encourage that type of work and around licensing, that would be really interesting.
Then just a final from me, just on sort of consistency and transparency, I suppose. I mean, presumably Vinous, for startups and scale-ups, consistency is probably key, isn't it, and to understand what they're supposed to be doing. And where do you think the government can come in to avoid sort of unnecessary complexity and to give people a clear steer on what they're supposed to be doing?
So I think, again, I would echo, we're going to probably cite this report for many, many years to come, but the AI action plan is very clear, which says, the UK shouldn't go beyond what the EU has proposed. And unfortunately, I think, if we're not looking at option 2, which is sort of aligning us to more permissive regimes, then we certainly shouldn't be going beyond what the EU has already sort of set out, because essentially we're asking our startups to try and create 2 different regimes that they need to comply with. I think in many respects it's a shame that it's taken us this long to reach a position of consultation. it's very bizarre to me that the EU is ahead of us in this respect. But I think ambiguity in itself is sort of to the detriment of startups and scale-ups. So given all the hype around like generative AI, etc., you would expect to see a really thriving generative AI ecosystem here in the UK already. Actually, the data shows that numbers are declining. So, the trends are not looking good. And the Lords Communications and Digital Committee published a report just yesterday. And actually, even the likes of sort of, the creative sector, so HoC, etc., said the ambiguity of the UK's current position on the application of copyright in relation to AI was consistently flagged as a factor limiting growth and innovation. So I think, there is an element of getting it right, but there are others who have, come before us, and we should look to them if all else fails. But there is also, the point of, doing it quickly.
Before we're going to move on to some of the details of rights reservation, do you think, just yes or no, do you think it is possible for the environment, the rights for environment, to be entirely transparent so that a large language model can identify every single part of creative content that's its input? Do you think that is possible technically?
No.
I can see it. No?
Yes.
Aha. And Stephen? Yes.
Yes.
Sorry? Stephen?
Sebastian.
Sebastian, sorry.
I would say this is possible, and the question
Great.
Oh, it's a yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry.
No and two yeses. Martin.
Thank you, Chair. It's a very interesting dilemma. I've spent a number of years working with startups. I was in that sort of industry pre-pandemic. So I've seen all this under a number of things. I'm also old enough to remember Napster and digital rights management going through a whole range of all of this stuff before. So I'm wondering in my head partially how much of this we're recreating. I'm very confused on this issue because I've met a number of people now who've described their job title as the manager of responsible AI. Now that isn't clear to me whether there's somebody who's managing the irresponsible AI or if it's just being unmanaged. But how do we tell the difference between good faith actors and bad actors? All of the things that we're talking about and all of the stuff that I've seen from you so far is sort of relying on everyone being a good faith actor. How do we enforce? How do we determine? James, you were talking about your compliance reports, which is fantastic and great and sounds really good initiative. But it relies on those people running compliance reports to identify and acknowledge all of the input that's already in their memory of their neural net. How can we enforce any of this? How do we stop this turning into the next George Harrison being sued for My Sweet Lord because what's popped out of an AI system sounds remarkably like somebody's previous work?
Great.
Yeah, sure. So I think, as with everything, it's about, firstly, I think, the UK government can take a lead here about identifying good actors and bringing them to the fore. So AI presents a huge opportunity, as many of you will know, to sort of the public sector, whether that's in healthcare, whether it's, sort of supporting decisions that DWP or the MOJ have to make, whether it's sort of, enabling teachers to take some of the bureaucracy off their plate so that they can concentrate on their students. And so actually, if we can actually get government to procure this stuff and bring it in and have systems in place there to sort of, bring to the fore the good actors, that would be a fantastic start. I think also that's a really interesting point about sort of like the outputs. Again, coming back to my earlier point, this is not about models regurgitating things. And frankly, if we're seeing things on the output side that do look like copies of, there should clearly be stringent enforcement mechanisms, to allow rights holders to take issue with that and to bring their sort of, to have their day in court, so to speak. And so I think, that there is that sort of like output side and actually capturing bad actors. And then there is the sort of, what can government do to bring sort of good actors to the fore?
I would say from my perspective, our company is very much focused on the input side of the problem, so we're not working on, for example, output detection or things like that. So I should preface my answer with that. One thing I would say is that we are talking to and working with some of the world's best labs in AI, and they're coming to us and asking for legitimate access to data. They are at the forefront of their field. They have already the world's most capable models, and they're looking to improve them by getting legitimate access to great content. And by doing that, I think that already is the natural world of competition amongst these products. The best products will be those created by the best actors who are legitimately accessing content, because that content improves their models and their capabilities. So I think if you imagine a world in a few years' time where we have these very powerful models in all these different areas, I think these most powerful models will come from those companies that we consider to be the best actors. I think the companies that are not behaving legitimately and are therefore maybe just getting the open web content, that effectively gives them the capabilities of today's models. Tomorrow's models will be built on that open web data plus access to licensed content that isn't publicly available today.
Thank you. Sebastian?
Well, I just wanted to mention that I believe that the opt-out methods and the way how to make opt-out declarations is related to input transparency. So when, let's say, AI model providers will generate the, let's say, identifiers and look for preferences, they already generate codes for the content that they intend to be using for training. So, and the rights holders always ask, I mean, in the case of James' model, it's pretty clear. So because content is actually actively provided and distributed to the model provider. But in the case of opt-out, it's the question, did you really remove our content? So what have you trained on, and were our terms accepted and respected that we have provided? So generating codes for content that are used for training allows to monitor whether opt-out declarations have been respected or not. And the same goes for the output transparency, where it's possible to generate an identifier for each asset that is synthetically generated. We see already with US-based model providers that they identify the content that they are generating cross-platform, and so that's also possible. So I would say transparency can be achieved on a fairly detailed level.
Right. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I'm going to ask John now to talk a little bit more about the technology.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I particularly want to address some questions to you, Sebastian, if that's okay. And you've started to go into some of the detail, but I'd be very interested in your protocol, the TDMI.ai, how it works and what you think is how it helps us in terms of the toolbox of dealing with these issues, and where you think then any gaps might lie.
Mm-hmm. So the TDM AI protocol is more or less like a description of a method that can be implemented by organizations, because most of the technology that is being used is openly accessible under a permissive license. Like, for instance, the ICC code. Anyone can use the ICC generator and generate the codes, be it a model provider or be it a rights holder or a service provider. And so the three components of the protocol is generating the ICC code, binding rights and metadata to the ICC code, and digitally signing this declaration. Because one thing that is often overlooked is you have to understand who actually made a declaration, who was entitled to provide rights information to a specific media asset. And so things like certificates and verifiable credentials are part of that declaration process to publicly make publicly accessible these rights preferences that are digitally signed.
Great, thank you. That's helpful. Can I just check? Is the protocol available for rights holders in the UK?
For sure. It's as I said, the components are described, and startups and media organizations can make use of that. And in practice, we already see implementations that are being done by international book publishers, for instance, that are generating these codes on premise. So you don't need to send any content to any service provider. They generate actually the ISCC code, the identifiers on premise. Then they attach the license and put it in a publicly accessible registry. And maybe one aspect, comment on the registry, because it's really important to understand that the registry technology should be federated, because it's really hard to find centralized approaches, or to actually implement centralized approaches in an international setting. So imagine like UK publishers and Italian book publishers, or German book publishers, or US-based music record labels. They would need to kind of agree on one registry where you could access the ISCC codes and the rights, the preferences. That is unlikely. So what we try to achieve is to have a system of federated registries where each media sector locally can make these declarations, and the codes, the ISCC codes, are serving as a means for interoperability of these statements and aggregation of these statements.
Great. Thank you, Sebastian. Just one more question on this. I actually wanted to James. James, what are your thoughts on the protocol and how it works and how useful it is?
I think it's really interesting. I think the challenge is going to be whether all of the creative community can participate in this. One of the things I think often as technologists we forget is that not every company we speak to is a tech company, and they maybe not have the capabilities to do this. One of the things that's interesting is the size of some of these archives, and we're speaking to rights holders who literally have archives that go back centuries. And if they're making those archives available at scale, they need a commercial opportunity to do so. And so I think one of the challenges is, yes, there's always value in defending things, but often what motivates is the opportunity to create a new opportunity. And so I think I'm really supportive of these types of protocols. I think there's loads of opportunity there. I really like the idea of it all being federated, a bit like, for example, how DNS systems work. So when you type in google.com on a web browser, how it finds where that server is a federated set of computers around the world. So it's not one single point of failure. That's a really great way to do this. So very excited about this approach. I think it will lead to a lot of interesting challenges around how creative communities engage with it, but I think over time, if they have the incentive to do so, then I think we'll see more and more engagement.
That question, this question of how easy it is for individual creators as well to access it is a key one, and perhaps we can return to that in the next session. And I think Alison is now the labelling of the output of AI models is also
Thank you. And James, I know you mentioned that you don't look at output labelling, so I might broaden this and have Sebastian input it, because I'm quite interested in some of the soft binding and hard binding protocols that you're doing for input, whether it could be expanded to look at output labelling. So with generative AI, understanding that it has been produced by a generative AI, and to have a look at how we can do that. So I'm quite interested in your thoughts on what information should be in output labelling, and how would that information be presented or made accessible to people so that they can understand that this is something that's been generated by AI.
So I'll take a quick swing, and I'm sure Sebastian has great thoughts on this.
Yeah.
For me, this is definitely not my area of expertise, but I'm excited about the idea of lots of new types of content, lots of new types of output being created by generative AI. One of the things I should say is, like, I'm definitely an optimist about the future of AI. I realise that might be a controversial opinion, but I think there's going to be a lot of interesting things that it generates. I think it is on the AI companies themselves to make sure that their outputs are correctly labelled. and that they are correctly maybe machine readable or otherwise, to say that this was created by our tools and provide some type of information, because I think that will be key to a lot of opportunity going forward and making sure that we understand the difference between what is AI generated and what is human generated, because that line will start to blur considerably. So I think going forward, I think we will see more and more efforts, particularly amongst the best actors in this space, to make it much clearer what has been outputted by their systems. I think the challenge will come when the bad actors have systems that are good enough to produce convincing output, which is hopefully isn't yet, but will be soon.
Already do. They already do. This was the announcement earlier was it last week? Whenever Sunday, wasn't it, when they were talking about pornography being produced by AI,
of course,
now being so good. So they already do. We are already there. So I'm sorry,
maybe
it's
that's
too late.
That's
and it's one of the big problems that we see in social media and videos and so on and so forth, which we in a different consultation inquiry that we're looking at. Sebastian, can I just go to you on the same question, but particularly sort of the technical aspects of what would be involved in such labelling and how it will be presented?
Yeah. I would like to highlight that it's not only the, let's say, simple flag for synthetic content, but you may also want to consider downstream use of synthetic content. So just one example, with images in the news industry, we have IPTC metadata standard that have what they call the digital source type, where you have like, okay, this image is 100% synthetic, AI generated. Then we have edited versions that have been supported by use of AI, and these or human-generated content. So you have flags in different gradual degrees of AI involvement, so to speak, that can be transparency used, and they, in fact, IPTC standard is broadly used, and it's broadly accepted as a way to flag content that has been used, and it's basically adding this information to the ICC code, putting and having a declaration requirement for the model provider that or the system provider that generates the generative synthetic content to generate the code and add this flag.
I do like the sound of a flag. I'm still trying to sort of understand how, like, you bog standard user scrolling through on the internet and looking at images and videos, how they would know whether it was AI generated. So it's great within the industry that they'd see those flags, but how would it be technically
So
presented?
if then, let's say a social media platform would have user-generated or user-uploaded content that is being shared and on these platforms, the platform provider can easily generate the code and have a look whether some flags are being associated with this particular ICC code or a similar ICC code. So that's a persistent way of binding this flag, even if it's distributed online.
That's really interesting, thank you. And I just want to ask about consistency, but if you want to jump in.
Well, I think we're going to have to move on because I haven't got much time, but I think the point that you're making, Alison, about if the platforms know that it's synthetic, but how does the individual know that it's synthetic? How does the person who's using it know? And I guess there'd be some opportunity to click on something somewhere and let you know, but that's part of the discussion that the sector needs to be having with the government in terms of what it is we want to see. I'm just going to move on now because we've only got 7 minutes left, and I know that there's a sort of a general question I think that Lauren wants to pose to everyone. I think Paul wants to come in here as well. And so we've got Lauren, Paul, James. Right.
Lovely. Thank you,
and
Cheers.
7 minutes.
Thank you.
3 witnesses.
No worries, it'll be nice and quick. Thank you very much, Chair. So my question was really going to be about the hurdles, whether it be technical or non-technical, going ahead. But actually just picking up on some of the comments and some of the questions, we do have issues with trust, I think, and it relies very much on honesty from good companies like yourself, whether you're licensing, whether you're showing that. So I suppose you mentioned about monetization, maybe that being an option to how creatives can share in the growth. But what kind of sanctions do you think we need to instill or need to be aware of so actually that there is that trust and the good actors are rewarded and those that are not so good, there is enough weight to hold them to account, as well as the hurdles we're facing? Thank you.
I would say, again, just to preface, not a lawyer, but my understanding is in the United States, for example, they have statutory damages for copyright infringement, which I believe we don't have in this country. Just checking with my lawyer. So I think any type of, if we wanted to put a sanction type system in place, then something along those lines might be interesting.
So I'll take the question on hurdles, if I may. I think it's really interesting to watch the debate the last week in the other place on the data bill and the amendments that have passed, led by Baroness Kidron there. And I think, I just want to put on record the big hurdle that puts in front of the UK's tech sector, in that so you had the Prime Minister talking about how he wanted the UK to be a maker of these technologies rather than a taker, and the Kidron Amendment, which puts in sort of extraterritoriality into these discussions, where it currently doesn't exist, essentially would mean that these models can't even deploy into the UK. Not just, they can't be made here, but they can't actually then be deployed here. And I think that puts us as a country at a huge disadvantage. There are many, many benefits to artificial intelligence being sort of, diffused right across our economy. I touched on sort of, the benefits to the public sector earlier, but there are, huge benefits to the creative industry. And I think it was the University of the Creative Arts that estimated that actually 40% of the employment in the creative sector would be in sort of create tech, so the sort of intersection between creativity and tech by 2030. And so I really hope that, when this House comes to consider, and this place comes to consider those amendments in the data bill, we sort of keep in mind that sort of very broad picture, and don't get sort of like, lost, lose the opportunity entirely. So I'll concentrate on the hurdles.
Thank you. Sebastian?
Yeah. So when it comes to the hurdles of the technology, I understand concerns from the rights holder side or creator side to use such a technology, and obviously the costs are involved and efforts are involved. So we don't need to ignore that. We must take that into account. On the other hand, the experience with rights holders that are actually using the technology is then much simpler than we anticipated, and that will be kind of becoming a standard practice of dealing with this kind of situation where we have the preferences to be published in such a way.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to ask Paul and James to come in very quickly. A minute each.
We had the Minister, Chris Bryant, before our committee last week, and he made absolutely clear one of the central requirements in this consultation is if the technical solution can't be found, the government won't go ahead. And that's why I'm interested in what Vinous said, which is actually you think those technical solutions are not really possible. That's why you're backing option 2. Whereas James and Sebastian, basically you're both suggesting that is possible. What I'd like to ask you about is time frames. We deal in timelines in this place. This consultation is time limited, so will this committee's report be? How realistic is it that those technical solutions could be provided and made robust enough to last within the horizon of this policy?
I think that's the question. It comes down to the requirements of the technical solutions. If you wanted to say that you just want a simple opt-out mechanism, which enables, for example, an entire organisation to opt out, you could argue that the Robots Exclusion Protocol does that today. But maybe you could argue that it doesn't. And so I think it depends on the requirements before we can put a timeline on it.
Sebastian?
We have to be clear that ISSC and this situation is new. And people need to be getting familiar with the technology. Software providers, service providers need to start getting familiar with the opportunities that come with this technology. So it's an early stage, to be honest. And the feasibility of that is currently being tested, also funded, supported by the European Commission, to understand whether the registry technology is feasible. There is a tender for a feasibility study for ICC-based opt-out declarations that has been published 2 weeks ago. So there's a lot of things going on.
Okay. Thank you, Sebastian. We're going to have to go. No,
okay.
Sorry, I'm going to go to James now.
Thanks very much. James, you talked early on about the original sin having already happened, which talks to a sort of fixed point, when in truth it's the original sin, some would argue, is continually repeating itself in new forms, new guises. This idea of grounding, have you heard of this? No doubt, I've read your biography. Just explain the threat to those of us concerned by the apparent dismissal of creativity's concerns to the threat posed by this tech advance, where that, to your phrase, the original sin is repeated every day on other people's work.
I think there was a period of time where these models are being trained. If you use any of the kind of models, sometimes they will say to you things like, my knowledge cutoff was at a certain point. Ongoing access to information through the effective grounding is a real opportunity for example, organisations like the news sector to provide up-to-date information. Those are licensing deals that are happening today. So I think that there is going to be great opportunity to continually moving forward if rights holders are taking control of their content, expressing opt-out by whichever mechanism exists, and then engaging in licensing. There is an opportunity for the creative sector to really participate in the AI economy.
Thank you very much, James. That's a really good message to end the session on. I'm afraid that we're now going to have to leave it there. I think we have been able to take something of it's not a deep dive, but a shallow dive, if you like, into the technical options to address the government's sort of preferred option in its consultation. I see, we've heard that there are technical options there with different levels of implementability, and we've heard that from one of our witnesses that doesn't think that it's possible to have a totally comprehensive opt-out regime, which I think is essential, and I think from two of our witnesses that it is. I think it's also clear, just for the committee, that the technical solutions are technical and complex, and therefore difficult to understand, and to expect that what we need to see is how creatives, from the individual artist to the huge news conglomerate, are or are not able to accept those technical solutions and to continue to make a living from that, which I think is what we all want. So we'll be hearing more from that in the second set part of the session. But for the moment, let me thank you very, very much. It's been a really interesting evidence, and after that, I will say order.
So for our second panel, you may notice the chair has changed seamlessly between myself and the brilliant Chion Wara. Because we are doing this jointly with this with the Science, Innovation and Technology Select Committee. So on behalf of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee in this Parliament, we're very keen to welcome our second panel today, which is Sajeeda Merali, who's the Chief Executive for the Professional Publishers Association, Max Richter, who's the composer, pianist and producer, and Matt Rogerson, who's the Director of Global Public Policy and Platform Security at the Financial Times. You're all very welcome. The Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee in this Parliament and the last has been taking a really close interest in the fair remuneration for creatives. And we've been looking at the opportunities of AI, but also the risks. And I think sometimes there's a real tendency to sort of pit the two against each other, to pit the creative industries and publishing and others against the AI and innovation. So we're trying to sort of navigate our way through it, and that's why this individual select committee where we're all being brought together is really, really useful. So what I wanted to do before we kick off is just very briefly to come to each of you and to get your reflections. You were all here for the previous stage of this session. I just want to get very brief reflections on what you've heard so far. Sajeeda, can I start with you, please?
Yes, thank you for inviting me along today. So just to let you know who I represent specifically, because I think it's quite relevant to some of the conversations that we're having today. So the PPA represents around 200 publisher members from the magazine media sector. So we're part of the broader creative economy, worth 4.4 billion to the UK economy, employ 55,000 people across a range of skills: journalism, videographers, data analysts, etc. I would say that we've got a real broad variety of members. So of the 200 plus members, lots of large multinational consumer magazine businesses, you know, the UK household names, Good Food, Good Housekeeping, British Vogue, Grazia, The Week, New Scientist, you'll recognise many of them, but also business media. So this is for decision makers that are helping leaders, people that are leading some of the biggest industries in our world. But also independent publishers, right? So SMEs all the way up to entrepreneurs, and some of them are delivering some really important information to diverse groups. So, you know, inclusive design, an interior design magazine for the disabled community, or Black business, for example. So I think we're thinking about it absolutely, to your point, you know, large conglomerates, but also those very small creative that are trying to sort of reach those niche audiences. So I think it was really interesting to hear such a diverse mix in that earlier session. There's lots of challenges that we're facing, which hopefully we'll get a chance to share. But yeah, I'm definitely on the side of, you know, what Human Native was saying. There should be an opportunity to protect copyright, to create a licensing economy, and to really think about how we can make sure AI, you know, is part of that growth economy that we're all looking for.
Fantastic. Max?
Well, I guess my sort of initial response to what we've heard so far is that AI is obviously a technical subject. The conversation was very, very technical. But I think the technical impacts different areas of human culture in different ways. You know, it's obvious, for example, that there is a tremendous benefit to the use of AI in medical research, scientific research, all kinds of technologies. It's not really obvious how AI can, inverted commas, improve creative things, you know. I don't think we've really heard people say the human race has run out of ideas for music and we need to automate that. So the argument is much less persuasive, I think, when it comes to the creative field. So that's my sort of initial takeaway. I'm not totally skeptical. I'm just not as persuaded as I am in technical fields.
Very good. Thank you very much. Matt?
Thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. I think you're probably aware, but the FT Group's headquartered in London, pays its taxes in the UK, which is quite rare these days. Comprises 18 different companies, including the 135-year-old Pink FT, FT Live Events business, an investment data business called FT Locations, a publication that looks at EU startups called Sifted, and Endpoints, which looks at biopharma. They're just 5 other companies within the group. As a business, we're embracing AI, so we were the first UK publisher to sign a contract with OpenAI for use of our journalism in training and also in display within their services. We're also using AI in the business. We're training staff to be AI literate or AI fluent. In the newsroom, we're looking at AI in investigations and investigating data sets. We're a business that we have no cost to the taxpayer. We're completely commercial. We create overwhelming positive externalities for wider society, but we do need to be able to make money. And I think that's where we're worried about AI and this consultation in particular. And I think in terms of what we heard earlier on, I think there was some of the misdirection that we've heard throughout this debate. One was this kind of concept of publicly available data. Mm-hmm. When you hear that word, just think, they want to scrape everything, because that's what's happened for the past few years. Is everything you've ever written on the internet, whether you're a consumer or a business, has been scraped by these businesses for use in training. And when they talk about kind of more diverse, better outputs, that just means they want everything. So there's no selectivity about this. They've scraped everything, and now they've used it for training these models. The other thing, I think, the misdirection is that the case law is settled in the US. It really isn't. Fair use has not been proved to cover what's happened either in training or what's happening in terms of outputs, which I'll come to. And that is the real concern for us. It's both the training, but the substitutionality of the outputs. The worst thing for a news publisher is to have the relationship between you and your reader mediated by an aggregated platform. We've had this for 20 years, right? Google will always kind of put bigger blocks of text in from other companies so that the user doesn't click through. And I think this is the big concern in the AI world, is that extract the value of all of the journalism for training, extract the value for outputs, and no value will flow back to our industries. And the worry for us is that's going to lead to a hollowing out of our creative and information industries.
Brilliant. You've all set the scene beautifully. Thank you very much. Now we've got just under an hour. We've got about 55 minutes to get through, and a lot of burning questions. So I'm going to start with Liz.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon to you. I wonder if I could start with Sajeeda and Matt and ask you about the challenges that AI development is posing for rights holders in the creative industries and media sectors.
So I do want to start by saying that as an industry, there is a huge amount of AI innovation across the publishing sector already. So AI is not new for the publishing sector, right? We're using it to drive efficiencies, understand our customers better, new product development, and also creative solutions. So we are also an industry that has innovated throughout the digital era, right? So when the internet came about, we had to pivot from print to digital. When the smartphones came about, we had to think about new ways that consumers wanted to access the information, and same with social media. So we are thinking about this as sort of digital 4.0, and I think this is another one of those big moments where I think the industry is definitely looking to gain a level playing field to continue its sustainability. Now, the thing to remember is that our industry's bedrock is fact-checked original content that's produced by humans. There is a human accountable, trusted brands accountable for what gets out there. And in the digital economy, the investment that goes into that fact-check journalism currently comes from traffic to publisher websites. So to unpack that further, traffic then turns to revenue largely through advertising, but also through conversion to subscriptions or selling tickets to events or e-commerce. And over the years, members have consistently told us that the majority of their traffic comes from Google search. And now people that have previously been relying on search for day-to-day queries are increasingly turning to large language models to have those queries answered. where publishers do not get any traffic, right? They get the answer, they don't have to go onto the publisher's website, and so therefore no revenue. So AI might represent the next digital evolution, but in the absence of copyright protection, this is a huge threat to the commercial structures that are needed for fact-check journalism, trusted editorial to be sustainable. So, you know, these AI models are being used by our readers. Essentially, they're a competitor for time, a competitor for engagement, attention, source of information. And in short, you can't have a competitor that has been granted free access to use your assets and your content to build a product that they are potentially creating billions from and not have any protection from copyright law.
And Matt?
Yeah, I'd agree with all that, but more. So the government's consultation focused a lot on model training. For the news industry, the real concern is what's happening today. Mm-hmm. So it's substitutional products today, like there's a search engine called Perplexity, which consumers pay for, and none of the money comes through to the content that's featured in the responses that come from that search engine. So Perplexity is a good example. Last week they changed their terms of service. I think I know why, but they changed their terms of service. Previously their terms of service said, we abide by robots.txt, however, we reserve the right to come onto your website and create a short summary of the stories that are on your website and provide them to a user. So what it means is they're not abiding by robots.txt, they're scraping the article and then providing a summary for the user. So nobody knows how they're getting access to that information because lots of publishers block them. There are kind of views that they may be doing using a spoof server to get in. Now they've changed to a position where they say that they use third-party crawlers to get access to that data. And what we know is that Google and Microsoft both sell access to data that they get from the search index to large language models. I think Microsoft sells like 14 different large language models. So that extracts value from news publisher sites, sells that value to LLMs as they query the search data in order to provide an outcome. Because the problem with large language models, they're a bit like an expensive car. You can have it on your drive, but you need fuel to get it off the drive and go for a spin. And you need data from publishers like the FT, from The Guardian, from others, in order to make the large language model make sense. And at the moment, there's no payment flow whatsoever from those people providing that service to large language models back to the source originators of content. And for a business like ours, so we have a consumer business, we also have a B2B business, we have B2B licensing. You have products coming to the market where a business can query the search index to provide things like long research reports. You can quite quickly see that that could become substitutional for the sort of products that we provide, that other companies provide to businesses. So at that point, you see kind of revenue streams at serious risk, and there's no way at the moment of getting a replacement for that.
Okay. And can I ask you both what you would like to, what your preferred outcome from this government consultation would be?
To go first. So obviously we've still got to the 25th of Feb and we're consulting with our publishers about that. But in terms of just summarising some of the top line themes that are emerging, we want a recognition that content has already been used and that is in breach of copyright law. We want recognition that copyright law exists and is applicable. We want recognition actually that the original creative content that's being produced by so many of our publishers is a key part of the growth that we're looking for in this new AI economy. But we also really need a practical solution for creative industries. I think if I reflect back on the sort of scale of publishers that I spoke about, not everybody's pockets are as deep enough to try and enforce that this works, and I think we need to think about frameworks that allow all sorts of publishers to come to the party and play within this. So when we say practical, we mean the burden of implementation sits with the platforms, burden of enforcement needs to sit with an independent regulator. That's where I would.
So I think what's interesting is the option that isn't there, which should be, is keep UK copyright law as it is and introduce transparency measures. There's nothing wrong with UK copyright law. It's completely clear that what's been going on is a breach of UK copyright law. I think Baroness Butler-Sloss, who's more learned than I am, she said in the House of Lords last week, there is nothing wrong with UK copyright law. She can discern that this is a breach of it. So actually, if you take the transparency measures, which actually we worked on with officials under the last government, they're pretty positive if you can get them right. And you can start to see actually UK businesses able to realise the value that's already been extracted through the training using our data, and actually start to build a market in the UK that functions. And we have got huge advantages in terms of the creative industries in the UK. It's a £126 billion industry. There's a huge legacy and archive of data which can be used to train models. Keep existing UK copyright law as it is. Introduce transparency measures. The question then is around enforcement, and I think we may get onto that into a different set of different questions, so I'll leave that for them.
Thank you. If I could just ask Max, you've signed the statement objecting to unlicensed use of copyright works for AI development. How prevalent do you think this practice is?
It's universally prevalent. I think all music has already been hoovered up. So what we're trying to do at this point is to establish a situation where that can in some way be remedied and protections put in place for the future.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to Natasha, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming in this afternoon. Just sort of thinking about where we've already been in this journey and the previous consultations and discussions, and you mentioned that you'd come in to work with officials previously. So, Matt, are you given your response in your sector's response to the last Parliament, are you surprised that the government has renewed plans for broad exceptions for text and data mining?
Yes. Sorry. Yes. I think it's very surprising. I think there's definitely been a change from opposition to government, and that's quite troubling. I think, obviously, the Prime Minister and Science Secretary have spent a lot of time with the biggest companies, so the biggest US tech companies. And it's understandable to me that they would want access to all this content for free. Which business wouldn't want free things, right? And they've got a huge liability on their hands if we are able to enforce copyright, because the scale of the kind of like processing of data and the scale of use of copyright content is so vast. I think what's equally scary is the kind of move away from thinking that competitive markets are a good thing. You know, if AI technology is as powerful as people suggest, the very worst thing you could do as a government is have 3 to 5 very large companies from outside the UK dominating that technology and being integrated into things like public services. Because, to put it bluntly, they've got you over a barrel in terms of cost. And, you know, if you look at the kind of, we may get onto DeepSeek versus US tech as well. If you look at the cost of building these products in the US compared to other countries where they're actually genuinely innovating, there's no magic money tree. We have to pay for that. As consumers and as business, we have to pay for that. So, very surprised about the change on copyright. I'm very surprised about the attack on competition as well.
And Sajeeda, are the current proposals at least, do you think, a slight improvement to the sort of previously proposed TDM exemption?
I mean, there's a whole timeline around the TDM piece, but I think it's worth remembering that back in 2022, I think it was sort of kicking off, AI was something on the horizon that needed to be addressed. And I remember coming into, back from Christmas 23, January 23, and ChatGPT was literally anything anyone was talking about. I mean, AI is definitely like the word of the year, right? And so what I would say to this, that the fundamental legal concepts have not changed. So, I have an example that Matt might be familiar with, actually, when the iPad first came out, it was argued by the Times that digital edition should be treated the same as the print one and should be zero rated for VAT. And the case was won on the principle that when the law was drafted, you could never have imagined that an iPad would have existed, right? So what they did know is that there would be a daily edition, a collection of news distributed to the public. It was a social value, and they won on that basis. So, and I think this is a similar scenario. You know, the whole AI piece has exploded. The investment into technology has gone up, number of players, the geopolitical implications. So that has changed, but really none of the issues around copyright protection or the need for a practical regime to actually enforce it has changed.
Sorry, just one more thing. So just given some of the evidence we heard in the first session, sort of what would be your sort of response to the fear that the startups in the UK, some of the bigger boys in the race, what would be your kind of response to the smaller startups around the fear that this could hold back their development and the fear that it could hold back them moving forward?
I think we've all got our favourite Kia, don't we? My favourite was when he talked about kind of a mission, you know, Britain being on a mission. And I think if the government had come to the content industries and said, look, there's a mission here, we want to get smaller AI companies working with the content industry to develop models in a way which kind of puts Britain at the forefront, the content industries would have been up for that. But instead it feels like what's happening is this is all being done to the UK's content industries. None of us have met the Secretary of State for Science. I think we've got a meeting in April with him, but he's not heard our concerns about kind of the proposals they've got in the paper. And I think that's a real missed opportunity, because I think what the deep sea development shows you is that the field isn't settled. And actually, if you get a collaboration between smaller AI companies and UK's content industries and the kind of creative history that we've got, you could do something really interesting. I'm quite surprised to hear startups arguing for kind of blanket commercial TDM exceptions. It seems to me that doesn't advantage them at all. It doesn't enable any kind of leverage for the British government to say, actually, because you're a UK startup, you pay taxes here, you employ people here, you can get access to this data. All it does is it gives a free-for-all for large kind of tech companies from anywhere in the world. And I think that will be a huge mistake.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to James. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, good afternoon. To Sajeeda, has the European Union's opt-out approach been working for the creative industries?
So, I mean, much like the EPC, the European Publishers Council, EMA, the European Magazine Media Association, so the PPA is definitely supportive of the advances made around the EU's AI Act, but we really echo their concerns about, having a law that actually enforces it meaningfully. So from our perspective, we don't think, we've got the same philosophy, but they've really struggled to create a practical solution that, all platforms are lobbying at the moment to say it's too difficult. So they're not really incentivized to solve the problem. That would be our response on that one.
What do we need to do differently to the EU then?
Well, I think, this is about having a legal framework that exists in our copyright law. It's about reinforcing this. It's about finding for misuse. But the key is transparency. I think transparency is a big part of that, making sure that there is a requirement to report on usage by the LLMs and the platforms. And this can be done despite the contrary claims, and then paying content creators fairly, right? Models exist at the moment, licensing companies, Apple News, LLMs need to have collective or individual agreements in order to make that work.
Matt, on the EU now considering whether central registries of opt-outs are feasible, what's your view on that? Sounds like a very limited library model almost. How do you take it?
Yeah, I think there's a heavy pushback from the tech community in Brussels. I think what they really dislike and what's absent from the UK proposals is if you haven't complied with the law in the EU, you can't release a product in the EU. And that's the biggest disincentive to piracy that there is. You couldn't contract with government if you hadn't complied with copyright law in the EU. We went through the IPO roundtables and it was collapsed by the technology companies. And the next thing we know, Microsoft's got a massive deal with the UK government. It's like, that's not setting the right message in terms of how you build these models. So I think we're sort of missing bits in our proposal, and I think in the EU, obviously, from our perspective, we think that kind of greater transparency is key. And I think what we're not saying is we want to know all of the model weighting that you use or any kind of secret source, but knowing the data that goes in is fairly basic stuff.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question to all of you. I think I know what you're going to say, but what would be interesting is is there any positives to the sort of fair use based regimes in America, Japan, and Singapore? Is there any positives that you think we could draw or lessons we could learn?
Well, no. I mean, not from an artist's perspective. No. I mean, for me, speaking as an artist, not as a developer or part of a tech company, or my interests really are just to do with my rights in the work I've made. I personally think, and I think probably many artists would agree, that there should actually be an opt-in model. I think opt-out puts the onus on individual artists to, in a way, police these gigantic multi-billion-dollar tech companies, which is a constantly shifting landscape, and how can an individual artist possibly be expected to do that? There needs to be, from my standpoint again, there needs to be a sort of verifiable, transparent value chain from the training data all the way through to the outputs. Any monetization of a work which is derived from training data by an artist should pay through to that artist. They're derivative works. And I think there should be no obligation to opt into that process. Artists should be free to either participate in it or not.
Yeah, so just to give you a sense of the scale of what individual web publishers are up against, we're working with a responsible AI company. We're working with one. They're called Miso.ai, and they do work with publishers to build answer engines using AI, and are brilliant because they're really positive about its use. But they found recently that there are 1,000 unique bots scraping data from publisher websites. That's across 3,000 publishers they found. We don't know who those bots work with, but we know that they're working with AI companies. On average, publishers have got 15 bots that they're being targeted by each for purpose of extracting data for AI models. And they're reselling that data to AI platforms for money. So there's that's where the money is. Don't go into journalism, go into scraping. That's where the money is. And then there's violations of robots.txt by companies as well, mixed up with that study, and hopefully they'll submit that to this committee. But one thing I would say, there's a lot of economic reports out there. A lot of them are written by ChatGPT itself, which is so I disregard those. But Darren Acemoglu and Simon Johnston, who are both from MIT, Simon Johnston used to be the IMF's chief economist. They say there are 5 key things you need to do to rebalance AI towards the consumer and to citizens. The first 2 of those are to ensure that the government needs to establish clear ownership rights for all consumers over their data and should tax digital ads. Well, on that one, this consultation would pass the ownership away and say that we can only assert rights after the event of the data being taken. On digital ads, I think this week it's suggested that we're going to drop the digital sales tax, which was brought under a previous government. The second thing is they talk about rebalancing the tax system so that you have a more symmetric tax structure, equalising marginal rates for hiring and training labour for investing in equipment and software. That's so that the incentive for AI isn't that you basically fire people and put AI in its place. If you want a kind of complementary AI plus human approach, you need to think kind of quite early about how you reframe the economy. And it seems to me on those 2 measures alone, the UK is going in the wrong direction.
I'm going to move on to Lauren now in the interest of time. Thank you.
Oh, lovely. Thank you, Chair. So, government consultation highlights collective licensing as convenient for both creators and AI developers. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, by retaining UK's gold standard copyright protections and by introducing robust transparency provisions, I think the government can lay a really interesting dynamic licensing marketplace. We want the right to have it, but we wouldn't necessarily want to mandate collective licensing. A lot of the licensing that's happened already has been direct deals between publishers and the platforms. But voluntary collective licensing, it should be a tool available to publishers, particularly the long tail of publishers. I mean, if you think about the utility curve, and you've got 10 of the biggest publishers doing a deal directly with the LLMs, they've probably got 85% of the content, right? That's the nature of the market. But I think it's that collective license that will allow some of the smaller publishers to play and sort of be part of that. So yes, and it is, I just want to add, it is worth saying that collective licensing does already exist in the UK. So some stats sent over to me by Publisher Licensing Services. They currently facilitate the reuse of published content by 12.7 million students, by over 9.5 million employees and over 40,000 businesses, schools and universities. It also provides access to over 8 million print and online publications, and over the last year they've distributed over 43 million in collective licensing back into publishers' businesses. So there is a route to get there.
Well, yes, I mean, we're used to it in a sense already in music with the blanket license, for example, like the BBC has for use of music in broadcasts. So in principle, I'm not opposed, but it's to do with how a thing like that is implemented and how that work is then valued and monetized.
Yes, I think collective licensing is good especially for smaller publishers. This ground has already been looked at through the CMA, and Ofcom did some work on a news media code, how that would look for the UK. It wasn't specific to a particular use case for journalism, but they said that there should be both the ability to do bilateral arrangements and also collective arrangements, and I think it would be good in this context as well. The challenge, actually, more than anything, is knowing where your content has been used and who's using it. And that, again, is coming back to transparency, both of training data, but also RAG.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Lauren. Let's move on to Alison.
Going on to data transparency, Ed Newton-Rex mentioned that it's the loophole here. What's the use of knowing your data is being used if you can't do anything about it? So to Sajeeda, is data transparency a compromise to allow for unrestricted training?
No, I think transparency is part of the solution, right? So you need licensing, you need copyright law to be applicable, and then you need transparency to enable all of that. I think when we think about transparency, we probably think about it in three areas. So you've got the transparency for the consumer. So, I'm just thinking about what's been said recently, AI platforms, they're big commercial organisations, and they're saying that transparency would be commercially sensitive. I think, to draw a comparison, if you look at the
irony.
The irony. But, if you look at the fashion industry, for example, I want to know what material that jumper's been made out of, right? If it's a lovely cashmere jumper, I know that that's going to be worth that value, or if it's polyester, I'm not expecting to pay the same amount out of it. And I think I think there is an element of it's the consumer's right to know what they're digesting. It's the same with when you go and buy food and you want to know what ingredients have been put in there. I think so that's the consumer side. I think when it comes to publishers and transparency to understand how they get fair value. If the AI companies are saying that the data used to go in to train the models is commercially sensitive, then I suppose that the belief has to be that the commercial sensitivity that they're worried about is that publishers are going to be asking for fair value. And to be honest, we would like transparency on that one. And then the final point on transparency is the implications of any decisions that are made. We had a digital collective meeting come together where a lot of our digital product leaders were discussing this today, and actually one of the things that was coming up was they're not sure if they opt out of things what that implication is actually going to be. So if they opt out of Google for their large language model, does that mean that they're going to be penalised from search and therefore effectively worsening the commercial situation? So there's quite it's a big topic.
There's a lot of unintended consequences. So I want to come to Max in a moment, but Matt, linked to some of the comments there, what would be the commercial trade-offs for AI developers if the government was to introduce data transparency, regardless of its approach? But in light of these unintended consequences, if we had an opt-out approach, it might skew the available data for their training. So as well as the impact on artists themselves as to how that would impact on them, it might actually impact on the quality of data available to AI developers. So, what would be the commercial trade-offs for AI developers?
I mean, and that is ultimately, that's what you want to create, is the material that goes into an LLM is what comes out of it. And if you train on rubbish, surprise, surprise, you get rubbish. And the same is true when they're scraping on websites for live information. If they're scraping really poor websites, they're useless and they'll go out of business. So this is the value that we bring. The problem is we can't see where the value is because we can't see who's stolen our content, and we can't even see who's taking our content in real time. So the two sides of this kind of debate can work together. We're just at this stage now where these very large companies that usually make margins of sort of 90%, they might have to take a smaller margin. And that's clearly going to be upsetting for their investors. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't. It's just a question of right and wrong and where we kind of pitch this debate. Unfortunately, I think the government has pitched it in thinking that you can't reduce margin of these big tech companies, otherwise they won't build a data centre. I think they're just wrong. I think morally and kind of like from the standpoint of encouraging investment in what we do, which I think is societally important, otherwise I wouldn't have worked in the industry for 10 plus years, it is possible to get this right.
I think it's quite good that it doesn't need to be a binary debate. And Max, from your artist, as an artist, currently, what do you do to work out whether bad faith actors have used your work legitimately?
Well, there's really nothing I can do. There's literally no way to do it. I mean, there are a couple of music AI models out there. And, it's perfectly easy to make them generate a piece of music that sounds uncannily like me. Now, that wouldn't be possible unless it had hoovered up my stuff without asking me and without paying for it. And I think that's happening, on a huge scale. It's obviously happened to basically every artist whose work is on the internet. In the longer term, that's going to lead to, I think, some societal consequences. You're going to get a kind of vanillaization of music culture as this sort of automated material starts to sort of edge out human creators. And I think you're also going to get an impoverishing of human creators. It's worth remembering that the music business in the UK is a real success story. It's 7.6 billion income last year, over 200,000 people employed. And, that is a big impact. It's the second biggest music exporter after the US. So, this is a big thing. And if we allow the erosion of copyright, which is really how value is created in the music sector, if we allow that to be just eroded, then, we're going to be in a position where there won't be artists in the future.
Good point. Talking of which.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Max. Matt said something before about really acknowledging copyright as is, but add transparency to it. So perhaps that with that in mind, just to ask you, Max, for your views on copyright protection for AI-generated work. Do you think that the status quo is correct, that such work should have copyright protection, or do you think that the government's instinct that these protections should be removed?
I think that's a very complex question. I think in order for there to be a kind of a verifiable situation regarding outputs, there has to be a way to register and measure them and log that information, whether that's an additional new right. I mean, these are really technical questions in a way. Sure. And obviously they would have to stand on a, some kind of legal platform, but, I'm a composer, so I don't know quite how that would be done.
You referred to sort of the distinctions between sectors. Would you think, or do you think that the government should consider sector or sectoral opt-outs, unfortunate phrasing, sectoral, give me an alternative to opt-out, given we're talking about opting out and opting in. Should we have a distinction between sectors because of the creatives not having run out of ideas?
Well, exactly, yeah. I mean, I just think technology, science technology and the creative arts are different things. We value them differently. They have completely different economic models. And I think they need to be treated differently.
Matt?
Two things, that's right. I should have said, actually, what we should have looked at through this consultation was also whether the non-commercial TDM exception was working as it's meant to. There has been evidence that academic research has then been repurposed as commercial businesses. So Andres Gardemus, who's I think probably given evidence to one or other of your committees, he talks about web videos being used for academic purposes, and then suddenly they appear as training data for Llama. So there's that laundering of IP that's been going on for many, many years, which should have been looked into. The second question, I suppose, is bigger, which is why are we here and why are we making these changes? I think we're told that it's to advance humanity and medicine, and often the AlphaFold discovery is used as the example that AlphaFold is going to solve everything. I mean, as far as I'm aware, I've done a little bit of reading into it. It's based on the Protein Data Bank.
Yeah.
So the Protein Data Bank is a public investment since 1971, which has paid public citizens and clinicians to code data, which has then formed this bank, which, DeepMind with AlphaFold has admittedly done a good job of coding, but it doesn't solve everything because AlphaFold also doesn't know structural biology. It exists in a very narrow context. So it gives this false sense that AI is going to solve everything and drive humanity forward, when in fact what it does, it's a probability machine, and it comes up with outcomes based on probabilities. So it's not going to solve every problem. And why is it that they need the full archive of FT content to solve cancer? It just doesn't. So it feels to me like this is all about how do we water down copyright so general purpose AI can be used to fetch stuff from the internet, not give any remuneration to the website owner or the IP owner, so that it enriches the companies that sit in the middle. And just for context, Google invests about £1.5 billion a year on DeepMind. It invests £20 billion a year being the default search provider on Apple phones. So if this was all about advancing medical technology and humanity, they'd probably be investing more than that.
Interesting, thank you. Did you want to say on that?
I just want, yes. You've each made very powerful arguments for the importance of copyright and the creative industries and the importance of the creative industries, and also I think the uniqueness of human creativity and the relationship to copyright. And I think, Max, you said that you're an artist and not a technologist, and that technology, science, and creativity and artistry were very different. And which I think, and I'm not. They are integrated. They're integrated in this question. In fact, they're integrated in all our lives. And science and technology, and I think our committee emphasises, is that it is a part of all our lives, and we need to be able to ask questions of it. And so I just want to try and summarise what I think the implications of what you're saying are for technology. And so I think what you're saying is that you want option 0, which was the status quo, with greater enforcement of copyright. And what that would mean, as I understand it, would be that the bots and the crawlers, etc., they would only take data from websites, etc., where it had been identified as being publicly accessible through the existing mechanism, robots.txt. which has its issues. So it's robots.txt plus some increased collective agreements where that's possible, and that the AI companies should negotiate all those collective agreements individually. Is that what you're saying?
These companies they can go to Mars. They can read, their scrapers can read machine-readable notices on websites. So that's not beyond the web.
Robots.txt.
So there is a follow-on to robots.txt in the making. The IETF, I was actually...
ETM.ai.
No, there's a working group called Control.ai, which then was changed because everyone realised that actually it doesn't control scraping, it just sets a preference. So it's called Preferences.ai. So that is in development. I think there was a question earlier about time frame of development.
Right.
It requires international collaboration on that, so I think it will be probably 2 or 3 years before that kind of standard is determined. In terms of licensing, we license today. There should be collective licensing. AI companies should come to businesses to license that, collectively or directly. I could send you a list tomorrow of all of the licensing officers that work through all of the UK press. It's not hard. Or the NLA exists, the Newspaper Licensing Agency. So the Newspaper Licensing Agency licenses on behalf of the whole of the sector. So if you're talking about does it add friction or not, the Newspaper Licensing Agency does that already. So they will license to kind of media monitoring services and others. It's not about the volume of people they have to talk to. It's because they don't want to pay.
Very good, thank you. Paul?
Can I declare an interest at the start by saying I'm a member of the National Union of Journalists? First to Matt, can I ask you about inferencing and artificial or synthetic data, which indirectly affects copyrighted works? How much of a threat is that, or how much of an opportunity is it?
So inference, as I say, is given very little airtime in the consultation, but every publisher I speak to is super concerned about it. And the reason why is because, especially with the two big ones, two biggies, they're not startups anymore, so you have to give all of your data to Google and Microsoft to appear in search, because they have to search your pages in order to get terms from it, in order to give you a ranking in search. So they have everything. Unbeknownst to website owners, they've been, as I say, selling that as a commercial index to AI developers. What that means is you can get the car off the drive because you put some good fuel in it. You can drive around for a bit. None of that money comes back to the publishers whose data is used in that inferencing. We also believe there are a number of other providers of that service, though their identity is not known at the moment. What's really disturbing is that when we've asked for identity of who those services are being provided to, we're given no transparency whatsoever.
And Max, can I ask you, obviously DeepSeek has put on the agenda the ironic reference, as we had earlier, the fact that OpenAI are worried about their own IP being lifted and stolen. Beyond the irony, though, it's clear that Matt talked about a Keir moment, and there was a Keir moment where he'd made an arts speech in before the general election where he said he was someone who studied flute at Guildhall, someone who actually really valued the arts for generation, for the economy and for well-being. This is someone who's unashamedly passionate about classical music. Mm-hmm. Is there a Keir Starmer that you want to appeal to in terms of this debate?
Well, yes. I think, I'm biased, of course, but I think, music is one of the most valuable cultural expression of human life. It's been with us for hundreds of thousands of years. It is a unique, or maybe almost unique, way to experience how somebody else sees the world. Somebody writes a love song, it touches us, it moves us, because that person has been in love, and that has informed how they wrote that song. This is what music does. It allows a kind of special empathy, a special kind of communication between human beings. So it's incredibly valuable. You don't need to be able to understand what somebody's saying, but a piece of music will speak to you. So for me, I think it's got a really special value in human culture.
And Matt, just a final one to you. Does the DeepSeek example prove that actually we've heard from the tech representatives earlier, that shows there can be a British viable AI startup that actually can outdo the big boys in America because it can operate at cheaper. Is the opposite the case, that you can flip that and say, actually, yes, but that doesn't necessarily have, you can have a British startup like DeepSeek, but it doesn't have to rely on breaching copyright. In other words, it can be a world leader.
Yeah, I think everyone's taken their own lessons from DeepSeek, aren't they?
I did think it was trained on an existing LLM model which had breached copyright.
So that's the other thing. Let's kibosh the idea that either DeepSeek or Llama are open source. They're not. Llama's trained on Russian pirated data sets of best-selling books, and they did that because OpenAI did that. OpenAI did that. And then they tried to clean all the copyright markers off them so nobody would be able to spot that they'd done that. So neither are open source. What's happening is these models are being put out into the market so that other cleverer people can find like new paradigms and change the way that you develop AI. I think it felt quite a wake-up moment where the week before you had the 4 or 5 men stood in the White House with their £500 billion project. And then genuine innovation comes actually from people who had resources restricted. And in that context, you do wonder, you do then go, where was the moment to actually say, how do we bring together the different parts of the supply chain in the UK to try and think about what is a mission for a UK version of DeepSeek? And as I say, I think content owners will be really willing to have that conversation because we all believe in the kind of value of the country and that we live in. It's just the fact that this is all being done to us. And in a way, the game feels like it's been given away too early. Like, it's believed that Oracle, Microsoft, Google, probably them, that they're the only people that can do this. And it's not, there is no technological moat to somebody creating a new LLM that is better than theirs and that is done in an ethical and responsible way.
Steve.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask a quick question of you all on the basis that no question is a stupid question around this table. To what extent
we're not on television or anything.
To what extent does it matter whether we get it right in the UK, given what's happening in China with DeepSeek, with other models, with the US? I mean, on what the UK government is trying to balance is a third biggest global sort of creative industries market versus third or fourth biggest AI market, and on the AI market side, there's the offer of huge investment, lots of jobs. And on the other side, on a sort of more restrictive model, sort of protection rightly for creative industries. But around the world, if we go for a much more restrictive sort of system, do we just lose all the jobs and it happens anywhere elsewhere? Is that what's your view of sort of the global dynamics around this?
Well, I mean, from my standpoint, I don't think people, speaking again just personally as an artist, I don't think, I would be, massively opposed to opting into a system which valued the work properly. That's all, So copyright is intact. There's transparency in what's been used and how the output has been monetized. I don't think people would argue with that, It's not like I'm some kind of Luddite who wants to just stop the clocks. I think if something fair and equitable can be found, then I don't think people would resist that. And I think that would lead to high quality situation, high quality systems coming out of the UK.
I think we shouldn't be. I think in every parliament around the world, there are lobbyists for the tech company and trade associations that work for tech companies, going around saying, well, Japan and Singapore and the US have changed their laws to enable AI, so you need to do it too. And when you actually look into it, you find that the US case isn't settled. Singapore's creative industries, I don't know how big it is, but I don't think it's massive. Japan, the law isn't as permissive as people suggest. So if the resulting AI model competes with the original source material, then that's in breach of copyright. And a lot of the stuff that we're seeing, a lot of the stuff that Max has described, would be competing with original source material. So there's a game being played at the moment, and the UK's position in that game is incredibly important. And we can't do anything about it as businesses. It's kind of up to the government, but it's also up to you guys. There's a vote next week in the House of Commons, which on the amendments that Baroness Kidron has brought forward. And we could say quite early on, actually, that we believe in creativity and copyright, and actually we believe in transparency. So if you're in the chamber and you feel like standing up for what's right, then I would urge you to vote for them.
From our perspective, I think, we want to create a framework that allows humans and machines to coexist and, in a way that's positive for humanity, society and the economy. But I think this is about balancing sort of a short-term growth agenda with long-term sustainability for the ecosystem. And I think, many of us believe that the creative sector is a big part of that long-term sustainability. So it's about finding a framework for both to go hand in hand.
Thank you very much. Martin.
Thank you very much. It's been very interesting. I was fascinated to use the iPad as an example. A lot of people say that was stolen from 2001: A Space Odyssey in 1968, where they had the news pads in the early scenes of that film. So that in itself should probably still be in copyright, but there we go. So you talked a lot about transparency, licensing and copyright. We've talked a lot about the current state of AI, where we are in a mass of newly working generative pre-trained models, GPT. We have yet to see real AI. We've yet to see actual continuous learning AI. Your suggestion, from what I'm hearing, is that although the consultation is talking of 3 scenarios of loosening copyright, you're actually talking about potentially, should it be looking at tightening copyright? And if so, in what case to cope with a changing AI technology? What would your suggestions be?
Explain the last bit again, in terms of changing AI technology.
The AI that we see right now is fleeting. In 2, 3, 5, 10 years' time, it will be continuous learning AI. It won't be trained on here's a language model, this is what you've learned, this is what you can therefore talk about. It will be continuously learning. It will be always fed data. It won't make the same decision twice because it's always learning from its past mistakes. We're in the realms of void camp tests as well, trying to figure out whether it's really AI or whether it's whatever it is. However, what we've got is not the end game. So how do we look at copyright in AI in a changing world? What needs to be, should we be thinking about adding to copyright law rather than reducing it, as perhaps the consultation is suggesting?
I'll be a Gary Marcus for a minute and say there's promises of AGI that have been made, and we'll see whether we get there. We can only deal with what we see in front of us, and what we see in front of us is people taking our content, using it for training, using it in substitutional ways. So from our perspective, we'll prosecute the same argument in every country where we operate, where we see our content being stolen, and that's kind of my response on
that. I think it's impossible to tell. It's impossible to predict how this is going to develop. I think copyright law works. It's pretty settled, and especially in the UK. The UK's got a really, excellent copyright legislation. It's led to a healthy creative ecosystem. It's led to a healthy population of music creators, writers, publishers, recording studios, TV channels, festivals, you name it. An enormous, great interconnected web, which really depends on that existing. So it works. I think it might be necessary to make additional categories of works, which would be works which are derived from AI material, AI-generated material. But I think it's really difficult to predict. I think, it's a moving target.
I would echo those comments. I think there are so many use cases as to how publisher content is used or creative content is used. It could be for training, it could be to display the results, it could be for fact-checking. Obviously, in the world of continuous AI, it might be something else entirely. So I think, with any licensing, we need to be able to evolve it as well. But, I would echo all the comments that have been made already.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, James.
there's a big ticking clock on this, which has been started, I think unintentionally. I think we risk backing ourselves into a corner, a tight spot on an issue that is well intended in terms of growth and embracing new technologies and new opportunities, but one that starts by undermining one of our biggest strengths as a culture. If you're in parliamentarian shoes, what would you be doing?
I'd probably ask for a more detailed impact assessment than the government has made so far of their proposals. I think the numbers you've heard that have been put out into the ether about the 400 billion, that was mainly a ChatGPT calculation done in a lobbying report for a tech company. If you look at the 1.5% growth the IMF has suggested, they also suggest that the labour market would reduce by 5.5% as a result of that 1.5% growth. So what's the cost of that? And who does it impact most? Again, if you look at the MIT work that's done by humans, they suggest that the people who it will affect most are women in menial jobs. So who does it affect and how does it affect them? And then how does it impact on all of our industries? And then much broader, because I think our industries aren't widget factories, although I love widget factories. What is the societal impact of stressing our sectors that are already pretty fragile? Like, we're a successful news organisation, we're growing, but we're quite rare in the context of a market that is severely stressed. And the impact of substitutional products coming through because the government feels like it's got to build a new data centre, what's the impact of that on holding power to account? And I don't think any of that's been considered. I think what's been considered is the biggest tech companies have asked for a watering down of copyright law, and the government have thought that's an easy win.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think the societal impact's really important. I mean, thinking only about the music sector, because that's kind of where I'm from. The music sector's already weathered an enormous earthquake with the onset of streaming, which has completely changed all the financials of music. The average income for a professional musician in the UK is £30,000, and over half of professional musicians in the UK earn £14,000 or less. So there's no room for less money to happen. It's already fragile, and basically exists on people's dedication and passion. So I would be very cautious about adding additional stresses to that.
I think this boils down to the fact that the fundamental principles of copyright exist, and what it is based on is it grants the artist rights and tries to move the burden of those rights to the people who are seeking to reuse it. So all we're asking for is that the intent and benefits of copyright are preserved. And we're doing that for the next era, and that the government doesn't accidentally change a gold standard UK copyright law that has existed since 1709 in the face of seduction of new technology and the desire to seek investment into the UK. UK copyright's clear, so...
Because sometimes people think these models are magic, they can just create anything. They are probability machines, so they just create material based on what they've consumed before. So they can't produce journalism or replace journalists. Mm-hmm. So if you believe that journalism and journalists are valuable, an AI can't replace that. So that's just something to think about when sustainability of news was a thing that we considered a few years ago. I care about it quite passionately, but AI can't be a journalist.
Very good. Thank you very much, James. That brings us to our conclusion. Can I thank you all for giving us your thoughts today? Thank you also to our friends from the science, I always get it wrong, science, technology and Innovation Committee for helping us broaden our horizons. I mean, I think we have to conclude that this doesn't need to be a zero-sum game, right? The creative industry is worth something like £125 billion to the UK economy, 10 times what the AI industry is worth right now. But, you know, we want to be able to somehow embrace the benefits of AI, but balance that against the real benefits of creativity and copyright. So we're really grateful for your input today in helping us to build a better understanding. And I think both of our committees want to carry on talking about how we can best influence that discussion as well. So thank you so much. Order.